Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope that we are all in the mood for yet another exciting panel. I have a pleasure of chairing the panel discussion on the topic Populist and Sovereignist Threat to the EU, New Trajectory for the EU, with a question mark. We have three panelists. Unfortunately, Hans-Joerg Trenz could not, at the last moment, he could decided that he had there were some important reasons why he couldn't come. But we have three excellent panelists. Jonathan White from LSE, Natasza Styczyńska from Kraków, Jagiellonian, and Sergio Fabbrini from Lewis University. I thought of organizing in such a way that there will be three questions asked to the panelists in turn. So it will be the first question, and then ask all of the three panelists to speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and then the second, and then the third. And then I would open the floor for questions and comments and discussion. We must finish sharply at 1:30 because there's lunch, and the lunch break is short. So in order for all of you to have food, I would mercilessly stop the discussion at 1:30 punctually. The questions which I'm going to ask are, I will read the question and then I would read again the first one. So the first question would be, should we expect the growth of populist and sovereignist ideas and practices in the EU member states in some time to come? What are the main reasons for that? That would be the first question. The second question would be, what should be the reaction of the EU institutions to this, especially if it is if in the name of national sovereignty the EU law is disregarded or violated? And then the third question, would a multi-speed EU integration be a good response? The panelists received these three questions a couple of days ago. So let us, if that's all right, maybe I'll just, so let me reread the first question. Should we expect the growth of populist and sovereignist ideas and practices in the EU member states in some time to come? And what are the main reasons for that? So I would ask Jonathan White to speak first, 5 to 7 minutes, please, and then Natasza, and then Sergio.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Zdzisław, and hello, everyone. So I guess the first question is roughly along the lines of, should we expect more populism in the future in the EU? It's I guess one of those kind of perennial topics which it's always worth posing, and I guess it's especially worth posing right now after the outcome of the Greek election and the implications for what I guess for many people were a kind of archetypal populist party and populist challenge to the EU, that of Syriza in 2015, in the first half of 2015. And so as we look at an election result in a contemporary European member state, perhaps most associated with a certain type of populism, I'll even come back in a moment to whether Syriza is actually populist, but for many people, the quintessential example seems to be somehow coming to the end of its natural life, and therefore the questions that one might have about the enduring relevance of populism seem to be more forceful than ever. I guess my general take on the question would be that one actually should expect further challenges to the EU and within European member states to governments of member states along the lines of populism, because it responds to something that hasn't gone away. And for me, that would be actually picking up on something that we touched on in the last few moments of the previous panel, issues to do with democratic choice in the European Union. You know, you can give many different accounts of where something one wants to call populism might come from. You can give economic accounts, you can surely give cultural accounts, and I guess I would generally take a sort of a political account along the following lines, that what gives a certain resonance to challenger parties of the kind like Syriza, but also on the right, is perhaps not necessarily the features of them that we tend to associate with populism. In other words, when people talk about populism, often the emphasis is on claims in the name of the people. A certain type of chauvinism is often understood to be linked to that, so a kind of exclusive claim to the people, a certain type of challenge to elites and so on. And of course, at a definitional level of what populism is, I think there's a fairly clear academic consensus that it's going to have features of that kind. But it seems to me that what has given appeal to such parties over the last, 10 years and more, let's say, is not necessarily the features that we consider as definitional of populism, but, in other words, not necessarily to be understood in terms of a type of exclusionary nationalism, for example, but that we might think of it rather as a type of response to a lack of democratic choice, and more specifically a form of governing that I would say governing in the name of necessity and a lack of alternatives, which goes back considerably before a period of crises, emergencies, as we've been talking about for the last 2 days, but finds its kind of highest form, I guess you might say, in these. Let me very briefly unpack that before I conclude on this particular first question. So, I guess one way of thinking about decision making in the context of emergency is that it's a kind of amplification of a logic of lack of alternatives, which is older, which goes back, in many people's account to the 80s, 90s especially. In an emergency context, policies tend to be justified as either unavoidable or the least of the evils, and therefore things that one does not because one really wants to, but because one has no real choice about the matter. I think as a rough summary of how political justification in the context of emergency government looks, I think that would suffice for now. And it seems to me, if one can summarize that as politics in the language of necessity, of unavoidability, then much of what tends to go under the heading of populism can be understood as a repudiation of that. In other words, the claim that politics should not be about necessity, it should be about volition, it should be about doing things because you want to do them rather than because you have to do them. I think you find that on both left and right, whether it's the Rassemblement National, whether it's indeed Syriza, and I mentioned both not to draw a kind of moral equivalence, but because I think there are certain features of the appeal of such parties and movements that have common ground. These, I would say, are parties that often exactly denounce a politics of necessity, first in the context, let's say, of Eurozone crisis politics, then also in the context of pandemic politics and so on, and say, we are here to take decisions because we want to take them, because we believe in a certain set of values, of commitments, of things that we want to stand up for. I think there's a democratic kernel to that claim, but of course it can take sometimes a kind of pathological form when it gets individualized, personalized, so this can be rendered on one form as a kind of claim to sovereignty, to democratic self-determination. At the same time, this kind of idea of volition, of anti-necessitarian politics, can take the form of personalized forms of politics, whether it's Trump, whether it's Boris Johnson, figures who somehow present themselves as transgressive, as precisely doing what they want to do rather than doing what a situation requires of them. I think to some degree the reluctance to act in the face of the pandemic can be understood in those terms as a kind of reluctance to act in the name of necessity. So the general point, just to finish my first intervention here, would be to say, when we talk about populism, let's not focus perhaps necessarily on the things which are definitional of populism, to do with ideas of people, of anti-elites politics, and with a certain type of exclusionary nationalism that often gets pegged to that. Let's rather say that what can generate support for such parties is in a context where many other mainstream parties are disavowing their agency and saying, we don't do things out of choice, we do things out of necessity. As I say, that goes back, I think, to discourses of globalization in the 90s, but then takes a more amplified version in the crises of the 2010s, in a context where this is, if you like, the predominant currency of political justification, then that creates a certain appeal for those that want to put themselves forward as agents of not necessity, but of choice, of doing things out of volition. As I say, I've said all that without taking a position on whether these are to be considered corrective in democracy or anti-democratic and so on. Clearly there's a second-order debates that one can have. But my general thought would be, let's not assume that just because some of the key political agents of populism in the 2010s seem to be suffering considerably at the moment, that this is the end to a certain type of challenge to political authority in Europe, because ultimately the context in which such challenges find resonance, I think, remains, even if political actors in their specificity may be suffering.
Okay, thank you. Briefly, if I may start with your first question, my answer would be, well, we actually already observe this growth of populist and sovereignist actors. So it depends from where you look at it. It depends whether you speak about a certain part of Europe, whether you look globally. But this rise was already observed. The populists and sovereignists are with us. They are in the mainstream. It's not anymore a matter of fringes of political spectrum, and they are here to stay. At least that's how I feel about it. So it's not a new phenomenon. It's nothing that we should be surprised with. But the question is, how come they grew so much in power? So how come they became a governing actors in several European countries? And what does it actually mean for the future of European project? What does it mean for the democracy? And so on and so forth. So I think that when we look especially from the perspective of Central and Eastern Europe, or Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, the Balkans, how you would like to call it, this very often, but I don't really like this term, new member states. They are not so new anymore. So, but you know what I mean by that. We see that this rise already happened. We have populists in power. We have them in power in Poland. We have them in power in Hungary. That was also the case for Slovenia, the case for Bulgaria, for Serbia, and to some extent to other countries in the region where they are, let's say, the second most important political power. And the question is, what does it mean? If they are governing, then of course it translates to the practice. So your question was about whether these populist ideas and practice, whether they will be more and more visible. So yes, that's certainly the true. And the scholars of populism, they used to say, populists, when they will achieve power, then they will stop being populist because they will not be able to realize all of their arguments. And we actually observed that that's not true. So that they found a way to actually still supply and deliver especially in economic terms, but also in rhetoric. So delivering the image of the nation, of the state, of the community that is desired by the voters. And this is the first point that I wanted to make, but the question is, what does it mean for European integration? And here I think it's also, we can link it to what we discussed yesterday, that when you have populist and sovereignist actors in power, then their view on Europe, their view on European integration is of course very specific. And we speak here about not a hard Eurosceptics, not about Euro rejects, not those who immediately want to leave European Union, but those who are much more pragmatist, those who understand that the public opinion is in favor of staying within European community, but they would suggest some kind of reversed integration, kind of a reform that is also not, I say kind of, because it's not certainly clear what they mean by reforming European institutions. So once we were analyzing all these proposals, we found the word reform, of course, everywhere, but when we wanted to understand what kind of reform they would like to see, limiting powers of whom exactly? Of European Parliament, of European Commission, giving power to the people, what that would mean. Who are the people? European people, are they citizens of nation states? And in this respect, then it's a trap, because what does it mean as well? Yeah, who are these people? Are they defined, the nation? How the nation is defined? Yeah, on ethnic basis, on civic basis. So in this respect, this discourse is actually already in the mainstream. Yeah, and we can observe it easily. But your other part of the question was from where it came from. Yeah, how come we are observing this rise of populism and sovereignist arguments? I won't be very original saying here that all of crises are actually very much helpful. And of course, we have also a situation when the EU is not deliberated enough, when it's not discussed, when it's taken for granted, especially in these countries that are, let's say, again, in a newcomers, that they were not the ones that actually established European Union as we know it. And in this respect, whenever there is a crisis, be it a war or refugee crisis or COVID crisis, then people consolidate around the charismatic leader, and these charismatic leaders happen to be also proposing this populist prescription for democracy. So democracy understood in majoritarian way. You know, we have crises around, let's not think about minorities, let's just do what the majority of people want, and this is their main argument. So they deliver actually the solutions that are simple to understand and simple to accept. But this needs to be combined with another factor, so with lack of deliberation, lack of public discussion about the role of institutions, about the role of European Union as a community. So this identity building process that we discussed here at the Jagiellonian many times, it needs much longer time, and it needs tools, dedication, and it needs to be probably also designed and implement, unfortunately, also from top-down perspective. So we will speak later, I guess, how to tackle this problem, but yeah, I think my time is over, so I will stop here, and over to Sergio.
Thanks, Zdzisław, because you raised a very crucial question, at least for us. Allow me to bring the outcome of research I conducted with Tiziano Sgaga and a group of research assistants, and it will be out, I think, on Journal Common Market Studies very soon. So the research was what is sovereignism, and it's useful to understand what is going on in the European Union now with a different concept than the famous three traditional concepts: nationalism, populism, Euroscepticism. So we arrived to the conclusion that there is a new narrative. This conclusion is based on empirical research. This narrative is what we call sovereignist. Sovereignism is a transformation of nationalism within the European Union. Sovereignists are, in many cases, populist actors. They bring the Eurosceptic tradition in their own program, but they are more than that. And so we try to investigate what happened. And to make a long story short, we discovered that there is a transformation of nationalism after 2016. The cost of Brexit in terms of economic implication, political instability, social exclusion, just not to mention Farage, what he said 3 days ago, probably we did a mistake. So the cost of Brexit impacted the right-wing nationalists that we investigate. A caveat, when we talk about sovereignists, we don't mean only right-wing party or right-wing nationalists. There are also left-wing nationalists, but we didn't have the time to do that within the EU3D program. We would like to do that in the future. So we consider two crucial political leaders, three indeed, in the western side, and crucial political leader in the eastern side. We consider France and Italy, Le Pen, Salvini, and Meloni, and we consider Hungary and Poland, in particular Kaczynski, Maciejewski, and Orbán. And we try to understand the kind of narrative. So they are populist in many cases, not all of them, but they are populist. But they are nationalists, but the discourse of this political leader in the post-2016 changed gradually. So we consider speeches given the European Parliament, speeches given to the press, speeches given to the party meeting. And what you discover that they try to endogenize nationalism within the process of European integration. This is a huge, in my view, incredible transformation, because nationalism, at least since 1950, was considered the alternative to European integration. So, and the debate at national level was a debate between those who say, no, I don't want to stay in this process, many on the right side, but also many on the left side, the Communist Party, many Socialist Party, and those who say, no, we need to go in this process for the reason that I tried to explain before, to constrain our democracy. So, and since then, there was a debate between nationalism versus Europeanism. After 2016, this cleavage is no longer there. At least this is our outcome of the research. The cleavage is within the European integration process, not between the integration process and those who want to stay outside. I think the Brexit was the utmost moment of the success of nationalism, but in the same moment was the failure of that strategy. So how could they stay within the European Union without giving up to their own kind of nationalistic feature? So our research arrived to this crucial conclusion. The first conclusion, they are not against the EU, but they are against the supranational EU. So we look at the speeches, Le Pen, Salvini, Meloni, and Kaczynski, Maciejewski, Orbán. They criticize the European Court of Justice. They criticize the Commission. In the case of Orbán, there is an attack to the European Parliament, the most explicit attack to the European Parliament. So what they criticize is the supranational side. And in the same time, I don't want to abuse of the Fabbrini model, say supranational versus intergovernmental. They support the intergovernmental side of the European Union. In particular, the speeches that we detected, they support the European Council. Meloni is explicit. No, the problem is not unanimity vote in the European Council. The European Council should be like that. It's the only forum for recomposing our division. So here, we raise an important question. We have a different challenge now to the European integration process. We don't share the same view of the European Union. And these are within the European Union, not outside the European Union. So it's not just hollowing out, it's to decrease the supranational side. Klaus Welle retired, so you don't lose the job, but they want to, to reduce the power of the European Parliament, the Commission, but they want to increase the power of the European Council. The second conclusion that we arrive, but this is a research, it's a process, it's like to make a picture of a movement, is they want to repatriate policies. And here we did a lot of research, empirical research. We discovered, interesting enough, they have different view on the policy to repatriate. So, for example, on the Western side, I explained why we selected those two countries. On the Western side, they want to repatriate economic policy because they benefit migrants and they penalize French or Italian citizens. However, to be within the Eurozone makes that kind of position much more difficult than to be outside of the Eurozone. Klaus and others asked me about Meloni. Meloni is a good example. She entered with this idea, stopped to the European Central Bank role, nationalize important part of the economic side of EMU, but then within the EMU, you have margin of action much more limited. On the eastern side, Poland and Hungary, the policy to repatriate are policy connected to identity. There are policy connected to condition, to economic condition. Here, the policy to repatriate are those policies which affect national identity. Migration, of course, is the most important of that. So here, the migration, the 2015-2016 crisis, helped to create the narrative that those policies can jeopardize our national identity. So, however, they have a problem of collective action. So I don't know what will happen in the next election, but the party we consider are different in different European Parliament groups. So they have different narrative. They have the same narrative, but different approach to repatriation of policy, how to put them together. This is the question that we are not able to answer so far. We gave a word for understanding this sort of strategy, nationally differentiated disintegration. So what they want is to disintegrate specific policy, but not necessarily other policy. Indeed, in the Polish and Hungarian case, in particular in the Polish case, you have the request of new policy, defense, for example. So it's not that they want to escape. They want to get back specific policy. And they want to reduce the power of the court, the Commission, and the Parliament, and increase the role of the European Council. So we discuss a lot on differentiated integration. I think what is going on the right-wing side, I don't know, but it doesn't seem to me that Mélenchon would have a different view on that, but anyway, what we see on the right-wing side of nationalists is the national differentiated disintegration. What kind of EU could emerge from this nationally differentiated disintegration?
Thank you very much. That went pretty well. And now it's time for the second question. The second question is, I remind you, what should be the reaction of the EU institutions to this, especially if in the name of national sovereignty and EU law is the EU law is disregarded or violated. So in the name of national sovereignty, the EU law is disregarded and violated, and what should European EU institutions do about it? What I was having in mind was especially the European Commission, but what Sergio just said, it emphasizes this clear distinction that for populists indeed, and for sovereignists especially, the intergovernmental institutions is entirely treated entirely differently than the community institutions, the supranational institutions. Okay, so Jonathan, if you would like to begin.
Thanks. Okay, so what should be the reaction to transgressive forms of politics in the EU? I mean, I guess we've all got our parallel accounts going on here, so let me just remind you where my account stopped a moment ago, because I'm going to try and connect back to it. So thinking of the types of political challenge that go under the heading of populism, or indeed sovereignty-based challenges, as a type of repudiation of politics done in the name of necessity. And I'll come into in a moment to what to do about that in the kind of the more specific case of particular types of challenge to EU authority and law. But in the more general sense, what does such a diagnosis imply prescriptively? Well, I guess the first thought would be, let's keep the EU in perspective. In other words, the problems of the EU in this case are a kind of concentration of political problems that extend far more widely beyond it. In other words, if there is a question of volitional forms of politics, challenging politics as kind of non-alternatives, lack of agency, disavowal of agency, and so on, that's clearly not something specific to the EU. It's something that plays out in democracies around the world, and I think that's one reason why, of course, things that go under the heading of populism don't just happen within the EU context. They are a function of political tendencies that go well beyond the European Union. And if there's any merit to what I'm saying about these being, as finding their resonance in the context of other mainstream parties no longer presenting themselves as forms of agency but forms of necessity, then of course any type of deep response to that problem would have to also start with other parties, not those that are mobilizing as populists, as sovereigntists, and so on. So this would be something that points to wider questions of the place of partisanship, of ideology in contemporary politics, and what goes wrong when those things become weaker. But of course you might say, well, there is a sense in which the EU is a particularly pronounced context in which these questions arise, and it's also the case that traditionally, and as Sergio has just mentioned, often supranational institutions do become the target of these types of mobilization. And so to that extent, there is a certain specificity to the politics of the EU as, if you like, generating claims that contest agency within it. And it seems to me, the kind of the general responses to that pick up on things that we have spoken about over the last 2 days to do with further democratizing the EU, strengthening the European Parliament. If challenges of the kind I've been describing are often taking aim at decisions that are justified by necessity, so a lot of Eurozone economic emergency politics, but also think of COVID mandates and so on. These are, again, things which in the moment of emergency are put forward as things that have to be done. Of course, there is plenty of space for agency in politics, both in those moments, but certainly before that in shaping the context in which emergencies arise. But in those moments of highest pressure, clearly governing is likely to often have this emphasis on, we've got to ward off the threats, we've got to do the lesser of evils, we don't have a huge amount of wiggle room here. So any type of longer term response to that has got to be, I think, on the one hand to do with reviving deeper partisan alternatives. I think in the EU case specifically, it's going to have something to do with cultivating a model of politics which is less that of emergency politics, in other words, that is less conducive to these types of forms of decision-making justified in the name of necessity, because emergency politics is always a combination of external pressures and endogenous pressures within an institutional system and its political actors that encourage a certain type of response to those external pressures. So stronger democratic structures with stronger parties within them, a stronger European Parliament, it seems that much of what I'm saying points in these kinds of direction. There's a more specific question that was posed by Zdzisław a moment ago, which is to do with how, in the more immediate sense, what should the EU institutions do in response to challenges to their authority and when EU law is disregarded or violated. I mean, this is it's a very tricky issue, and I think it's partly such because there's always a considerable amount of interpretation that has to go into identifying violations of law and giving that capacity of interpretation to a technocratic institution, I think, is not particularly satisfactory. In other words, making the Commission the institution expected to police the rules of the game and ensure that transgressions, for whatever reason they arise, are addressed in some form, I think is entirely unsatisfactory, because that authority has to be, in my view, directly democratically mandated. It can't be done by a technocratic institution because of the amount of interpretation, distinctions that have to be made in what counts as a violation, the danger of making this a set of double standards that apply differently to peripheral countries from core countries and so on. Again, themes that we touched on earlier this morning. So I think short of that type of democratic authorization of institutions able to perform that role, and this could be about strengthening the European Parliament or making the Commission more embedded within the European Parliament, but short of that type of change that creates democratically authorized institutions with the capacity to monitor these types of transgression, I don't hold great faith in expecting technocratic institutions to do that. I think that is dangerous, and I think on prudential reasons one has reasons to be concerned. In other words, to do with if what I'm saying about sovereignist challenges as being inspired by, if you like, the desire to show volition, choice, to repudiate these types of efforts to constrain from above, then I think this type of response is only going to amplify that. But that's a prudential argument. I think more the principled argument would be giving this type of authority to, as I say, to an institution outside a democratic structure at the supranational level is wrong in principle. So I think it can only be part of a longer-term project of creating the type of constitutional moment that allows a much more democratically integrated form of politics at a supranational level, where you could then begin to think about these types of interventions as democratically authorized. I think short of that, one has to be quite concerned about efforts to police these with institutions that make decisions with great discretion and yet don't have the democratic authorization that goes typically with that.
Thank you. Well, the answer to this question can be tricky, because the reaction, what type of reaction shall we expect? Yeah, but it depends what we want to achieve. And I think that I would like to go back to what Sergio explained about the main claims of the sovereignists, and this, of course, overlaps with majority of the arguments voiced also by populists. So as you mentioned, these two are interconnected, and if we look at their main claims that EU institutions and EU in general is undemocratic, yeah, it doesn't represent the citizens. The institutions are not elected by the citizens, so the citizens have no say, and that it all evolved in a direction that all of the institutions are over controlling, right? So their argument here would be that this is all fine, but we need to make a step back, right? And the question is, I mean, how the institutions should react. It depends whether we would like to follow that trend, yeah? So it depends what the future of European Union we have in mind, because the institutions are also not given there from the top, right? They are elected, they are chosen on the base of deliberation or elections in the member states. So in this respect, when we think about the populist in power, when we think about populist governments, they do have a direct impact on what is happening in European institutions as well. And in this respect, I think that this answer might be tricky, because if this will be a predominantly existing narrative, then maybe actually making this step back would be what they will be claiming for. But for now, when we look at the situation right now, while we speak, I guess the main question is about the reaction towards the existing problems with the rule of law in the member states like Poland and Hungary. Somehow overlooked similar problems in Bulgaria, for example, that are rising up all of these challenges and questions whether Commission, especially Commission, should push more or whether it should let the things happen, like we heard during the previous panel, that maybe if this is what the citizens want, we should not actually stop them. Yeah, I'm not really sure whether I agree with this view, but that was quite a valid point, and it woke you all up. So I think that this is something that we could think about. But my main point here would be that if we want to keep European Union in the shape we know now, and if we would rather be in favor of more political integration in the future, then the institutions should react rather harshly, and they should not make any differences between the member states, and they should not apply what I would call, and that's maybe not very politically correct, the double standards. So not follow this logic of stabilitocracy. So not appease those regimes that are actually turning into more authoritarian direction in the name or in the sake of stability, economic stability, political stability, but also because of security issues. And this is a thing that I think is quite controversial, that's not very much discussed. Why, for example, we kind of turn a blind eye towards Serbian populist sovereignists, Bulgarian populist sovereignists, why these negotiations and criticism over the conflict with European Commission here in Poland since the war in Ukraine started has been less visible, right? Less vocal. So in this respect, I think that this is an important thing, to keep the standards and to pressure all governments equally, or not to pressure them at all, yeah? But not to imply different standards of different member states. And the second thing is that, I mean, we don't maybe have enough time to do that, but it just brings me back to our research in Work Package 5 when we looked at the non-governmental organizations. They are the key. And if you want, you can invest in them, you can help them, you can engage them in promoting liberal democracy, in translating what liberal democracy is. But the thing is that here again we have a trap, because very often it turns out that we actually sponsor a governmental organized non-governmental organization, yeah, so-called GONGOs, or uncivil society, if you like it. That's also a term that we find in literature. And the civil society part is very often overlooked, but this is, for me at least, seems to be one of the most important factors. And institutions cannot act without engaging civil society, or if they do, then they are detached from the reality. And this is exactly when these populist, Eurosceptic voices are popping up, claiming that institutions are doing things without consulting the citizens or without even accepting the feedback that is sent to them. So yeah, just to touch the top of the iceberg here.
Thanks. This is a much more difficult question for me. I use, let's say, I remain on the systemic perspective more than to enter in the political perspective, let's say. It seems to me that the European Union does not have the institution for dealing with the cleavage concerning sovereignty. So the implication of this assumption should be discussed, but the European Union, at least since the very beginning, started with the idea that sovereignty was not an issue. Think about the Italian constitution, the French constitution of the Fourth Republic, the German constitution, fundamental law, all of them have clauses, articles in which they recognize the need to share sovereignty with other countries on a condition of parity. So there was no problem. So for those coming out from the Second World War, it was clear that sovereignty should be contained, should be in some way domesticated. And still now, for example, it is not by chance that Meloni, when she was at the opposition, the very first act she did in when the previous legislature, the Draghi legislature, she introduced an amendment to the Italian constitution trying to abolish these articles. Article 7, in which she say Italy is available to share sovereignty with other countries on a condition of parity. So till Maastricht, that was an assumption. And the issue was the single market is basically a process through which we distribute goods, possibility is the benign approach to the European Union. The thing changed with Maastricht. And since Maastricht, we have the arrival, the increasing role of sovereignty issue within the European Union. And sovereignty is a very complicated concept, not only because it has to do with national identity, with role of national government, so try to justify the increasing role of national government, but also because in the European tradition, sovereignty is a unitary concept. We are still with Jean Baudin. Either you are sovereign or not. So they debate. So I tried to follow in other work I did, the debate on even in the Constitutional Convention. I had the conversation with Giuliano Amato, who was the vice president in that period, was professor in that period in my school. And the discussion about sovereignty is either sovereignty is in the states or in the European level. And still now, I spend a lot of time to understand, for Macron, what does it mean, European sovereignty? I never understood. It was always, a kind of rhetorical claim, but you don't have the explicit definition of what does it mean, sovereignty, for the most important supporter of European sovereignty. And thanks God, there is somebody raising the issue of European sovereignty. So, how to come out from that? There is what can I do is to talk about concept and then leave to the politician eventually to deal with deeds, with facts. So we need to unpack sovereignty. Sovereignty is not a unitary concept, can be divided, can be unpacked. You can be sovereign on a certain level and not sovereign on another level. The question is, the definition of sovereignty cannot pass only through social process. It requires a constitutional moment. This is not a deterministic sociological approach. that is more and more diffuse in our discipline. We have to open up a constitutional discussion about sovereignty. And that obliges us to identify those crucial policies in which member states cannot be sovereign, and they have to share sovereignty with others. But that requires a discussion, a political debate, where there are many policies that now are Europeanized that I don't think should be decided in Brussels. So this neo-functional approach led to a sort of centralization around an economic constitution, which was useful to overcome limits, constraints, but also create more problem than solution. So yeah, I don't know exactly how to escape from that. But even the debate on we need more Europe or less Europe, but what does it mean, more Europe or less Europe? More centralization or less centralization? What do we need is a proper distribution of competence between member states and the center. I don't know if that is more or less. I found this very, in a way, vulgar, very limited in intellectual terms. But I think that the question for Europe is, for the European Union, is to identify a method for distributing those competences. And which are the method in the intellectual job market for doing that? I mean, I don't know other method as a comparativist than the federal method. But of course, the federal method was the federal F, as Klaus said this morning, was considered by those who needed to have more reliance on that method a kind of a bad word. So I think that what we should need to have now is a discussion on this distribution of competences and to protect the states, but also to protect the center. Why to protect? Because there are policies that the state cannot do. And there are policies that the center cannot do. And I would say that probably the true discussion about sovereignty is to create a political discourse that goes in the direction of unpacking of sovereignty and ask politicians to say what is crucial for you and what is impossible for you to do. This is more than what the institution can do, is a way for creating the preliminary condition for asking the institution to do something.
Okay, thank you very much. Now the last question, and please be brief because I need to have about 15-20 minutes for the general discussion. So the third question is, would a multi-speed EU integration be a good response to these problems of sovereignists and populists? And just maximum 5 minutes, please.
Thanks. So now we get to say what we really think about differentiated integration, and it's all a load of bollocks, isn't it? I'm a bit of a skeptic of differentiated integration. I think partly because it's very difficult, I think, to tell a general story about it. I mean, so much depends on specifics about which policies, which domain, which states, which motivations, which arising power relations. So it's tempting to say one wants a good kind and not a bad kind, but of course how you get the one, not the other is very difficult to arrange if the premise is that you don't have some type of organizing center that is controlling which type of differentiation is arising. So I find it hard to make a general claim about this, but insofar as I can, I'm generally skeptical, I guess, and I'll say a few familiar reasons and then maybe a few extra ones at the end. I mean, partly it seems to me that it does point towards the normalization of states preaching from what can sometimes be progressive policies, not necessarily always, but it can often be those that are the first casualties of some types of differentiation. and it's likely to frustrate cross-national alliances of principle. In other words, those kind of things that might create the will to have more of the progressive and less of the non-progressive cross-national harmonized policies. It's, of course, extremely fiddly. I never feel more stupid than when I'm thinking about differentiated integration. Very, very hard to follow, as I say, partly because I think it's always a story of specifics, and the effort to tell some kind of pattern story about it as a whole is difficult. But it's messy. It leads to messy arrangements. It reduces the intelligibility of the order, and so on. And I think also it's perhaps premised on a very positive and respectful reading of the nation state as a expression of valuable diversity, as opposed to simply the legacy of yesterday's hegemonic projects, that it's a site of working representation. In other words, that the state should be treated as basically working in its current form, and therefore differentiated integration as some type of expression necessarily of democratic will. I just don't find that entirely convincing. So insofar as many arguments are about are in the name of the contemporary state and the nation state, I don't see the contemporary nation state as in the good enough health that might be required to justify that. A general point, zooming out even further, I mean, I guess there are larger questions of economic power here. Classically, I guess people have tended to argue that capitalism likes uniform legal orders, that it likes to have kind of continuity across a large space. That's the kind of the story of the making of the nation state as something that is conducive to capitalism. And then you might say, well, if that is the case, then anything that disrupts continuities of policy, of institutions across space is something that is potentially a challenge to economic power. But of course, it may be that economic power and the larger capitalist framework has evolved such that it no longer seeks continuity of regulations and uniformity, but actually that differentiation serves it very well, and that contemporary corporations and concentrations of economic power may be a benefit rather than a challenged by differentiation in a very general sense. And so to that extent, I do have some concerns about whether it is truly disruptive or rather a conservative form of accommodation of existing power relations. And finally, I think there's something that Jan-Erik alluded to yesterday when charting the ways in which the project as a whole has been evolving in a line with recent events. After contemporary events of the last year, the geopolitical dimension of current European politics to do with Russia-Ukraine and the response to that, it seems to me that potentially this puts us in a slightly different world in which the desire for more military capacity, more economic capacity is being stated with increasing assertiveness. And in that context, it seems to me that the differentiation as a way of trying to make the current EU workable is to my mind, less appropriate in this context. This is now about an order that has claims to increasingly strong competences in increasingly central areas of policy making, and that requires constitutional responses as opposed to the mosaic of accommodations that go with differentiated integration.
Yeah, I'm trying to make it brief. Just what came to my mind right now is that we actually have a bit of an answer coming from the research we conducted with Elodie Thévenin, that is here with us as well. Because we were actually trying to understand if these populist voices are would be actually in favor of a multi-speed Europe, or what type of scenario would be the best for them, if not more integration, more political integration. And what we found out is that they are also not in favor of that. So of course, people who are in favor of more political integration are not happy with this scenario, but also those who are opposing further political integrations, those who are contesting the role of European institutions, they are also not happy. So they see this multi-speed Europe as a form of dominance as well. They see it as bringing a situation in which the ones that are not in the core are actually second category member states. And that anyway, even if they are not part of the main gang, they are still influenced, dominated by the bigger, the richer, the more powerful member states. And in this respect, we observe this cherry picking here, so a kind of elusive concept of reform that would allow them to pick the policies they like, for example, now defense or foreign and security policy, of course, but then to deny integration in other forms. And this is quite interesting, because you would think that actually those who are not in favor of more political cooperation would go for this multi-speed Europe in order to keep their space, for example, within the economic cooperation. But that apparently, at least according to our research conducted on the MAPs, yeah? So in the European Parliament, that was actually not the case. So in this respect, I'm not really sure for whom this multi-speed Europe would be actually an ideal scenario, because it seems that neither for those who are pro-European nor for those who are opposing the European project.
Very brief, it seems to me very difficult to use multi-speed Europe for dealing with the divide, the cleavage that I said before. Multi-speed Europe could be useful as a strategy in order to allow member states to adapt to the acquis communautaire. But when you have a division on finality, the question is not multi-speed Europe. So, and this division did not start, or has not started with the 2004-2007, already with the enlargement of the 90s. There you have the entrance of a different view on the European finality. And for the Scandinavian country, for example, it's clear that for them is mainly an economic confederation, is a commercial republic, to use the James Madison interpretation. And if you have a look, probably you did already, to the speech given by the Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki at Heidelberg, where he thinks that to fight against the Commission is an anti-imperialist struggle, then you understand that this is not a question of I need time to adapt to the acquis communautaire, is a question which has to do with the finality of the European integration process. So what is the alternative to that? That would be the research that we do organize, Jon Erik, for the next horizon 23, 26. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you all for all this series of speeches, but that's pretty coherent view, I think. Now we have 15-20 minutes really for discussion, which is pretty nice. So who would like to? And then okay.
Who was the first one?
No. Yeah, I think so. Yes, I think it was first.
Thank you very much. I have a question for the panelists, whoever would like to reply. So I find it very interesting, this question of sovereignty and the possible splitting of sovereignty, so moving from sovereignty to sovereignties. And I'm trying to address this in what is probably my research obsession with the fiscal integration, so to move into a two-dimensional fiscal sovereignties for the European Union. But how do you sell this to national public opinions, that transferring some form of sovereignty to the European level does not is not equal to necessarily to a loss of national sovereignty? So this is a bit the question that remains unclear to me. So how can you explain this in a clear way at domestic level? Because this is ultimately what sovereigntists fear, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just take two or three more questions, and then I ask the panelists to answer.
Okay, mine is more of a provocation slash an attempt to give a possible answer to the big elephant in the room. What to do? What to do? I mean, this is definitely. I don't want to say that I have an answer to that, but a little bit maybe of an idea, which is taking a couple of things into consideration. First of all, that if you want to fight back or like deflate the populist slash sovereignist narrative, maybe one political strategy is to try to go a little bit higher and consider the request as legitimate in the political debate, rather than me against you kind of polarization. Second element, take some of the debate that we are having so far about sovereignty, all the different solutions, multi-speed, the different differentiations and so on, they're all kind of static. Static in the sense that they take into consideration that there should be at some point a magic formula to say this kind of power needs to go at that level, this other power needs to go at that level. But we know very well that, especially in the dynamics that we've been living in the past few years, we live in a dynamic situation where we might need to pull certain competencies for limited amount of time together and build the infrastructure for those competencies and those sovereignties to be together. Let's say COVID, like we should have been able to have a health response and a health union, which then could have been not dismantled, but at least given back to the member states or even to the regions. In Italy, for example, health is a regional competence. So deconstruct this thing in a dynamic way and also on a multi-level way, so not reifying the national level as well, and also consider the fact that we need to go also on the local level and so on. And I think subsidiarity, a radical dynamic subsidiarity, could be an interesting idea to be explored.
Thank you. One more? Yeah.
Thanks. Yes, I agree with Jonathan. I have the same type of spinal response to differentiated integration. One of the things I think is that, as you said, I think it is less immediately relevant now because of the recent developments. But I also tried to say yesterday that I think it leads to an overly limited academic agenda, and especially on the issues of democracy and domination. And I also wonder if not the idea of making exemptions and sort of different legal systems is deeply problematic in itself, and that it is also a reflection of the lack of capacity, fiscal and other forms of capacity. Because if you have fiscal capacity or general capacities, you can deal with a lot of the different sources of diversity and difference and find creative solutions to them without necessarily having to alter and modify the legal structure, because that seems to me to be the most problematic one. And if you think about other states, I started looking at Norway, and this is a unitary state, but it is institutionally so diverse. If you look at different functions are organized differently at the different levels. So this is a tapestry of organizations. It's not coherent as we think. It's an optical illusion to think that the state is symmetric and organized like this, whereas the European Union is not. This is not the case, but it is legally uniform. And I think that's a critical issue, that if the law is being modified and altered according to circumstance like that, this is a much more risky game in political systems than to have institutional differentiation. So I think that's sort of, I want to do a small article on this, a survey. It's just to show all the complexity of a bloody little country like Norway in this sense. And then sovereignty, Sergio, I can't resist it. Riker had a wonderful article where he talked about the problem of sovereignty for federalism. Riker in 70s. he said that sovereignty is something that came with a nation state, Boudinian notions and so on, and it is destructive of federalism. But I think we should drop it. I think we should simply say sovereignty is, like McCormick said, is like virginity, either you have it or not. And it's a legal and confined concept, and let's rather go for another term, for instance, autonomy. And I think autonomy is a much better term, actually, in this sense, because it has all the flexibility. So then we can get out of the whole sovereignty debate. Thanks.
I would like to go back to the question that we see on the slide about the new trajectories for the EU. As we also debated yesterday, the sovereignist proposals are actually visible in, I think, all of the studied context in national debates that we studied, but they're different in a way. And there is an old disease that is at that end of a political spectrum. They know, even though we have those views, they're pre-Brexit, they're very diverse internally. They're very heterogeneous. And that, ends up with the problems of them, aligning in the European Parliament groups and so on. But is there anything new in this proposal after Brexit that we call sovereignism? And I would like to specifically direct it to Sergio, because you propose the divide that goes along the line east-west in a way. But if you actually look at this, it's a question first, and it's visible in our parliamentary study. There is a different narrative behind those who are in power and those who are not in power when it comes to sovereignist. The latter, they can say more, and they're less caught on inconsistencies in their claims. The second point, you raised that there is an economic argument on the side of, the West member states, because they want to repatriate economic competences. You don't have that debate if you look at the face value in Poland and Hungary, but if you actually look at the arguments why they don't want to join the Eurozone, you have the same arguments. So, is it really identitarian versus economic, argument there? Or is it something that, what differentiates them really is something more? And many scholars are looking recently at this cultural level. Is there possibility for the sovereignists to really find a, pan-European narrative overcoming their differences? Or is it going to be the old story of, ending up with a very diverse and heterogeneous narratives in the end of the day? And then it will end up with being, a term that we gave, and it will join the Holy Trinity, which you refer to as a kind of another one, but not really resulting in a proposal. Or is there really finalité politique proposal in a sovereignism? So that actually is my question.
Thank you very much. In a way, one of my 2 points stems directly from that last one, because I'm interested in networking between populists as a threat to the trajectory for the European Union. One, obviously, at a political level, they haven't been very effective within the parliament. They've been disorganized, so I'd like your view on that. Secondly, there are wider international links. I mean, obviously, one obvious thing is the links between some elements in the US Republican Party and Orban and other populists within Europe. To what extent is that a threat? And the other is their use, which I think is related, to some of the research you've done on the use of social media by populist parties. To what extent do they have some common European themes, or to what extent are they mainly concentrating on national themes, like Vox seems to be on defense of bullfighting and traditional Spanish culture, rather than any European theme? And then final, very short question, and that is, what is do you feel, of the impact of these populist ideas on so-called mainstream European political parties and governments? What impact are they having? Because that seems to be the most fundamental question of all. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I would like the panelists to try to respond. Maybe. Thank you. Maybe we start from Sergio now.
Okay. First, I don't know how to answer Tiziano, because this is a very crucial issue. So it is an issue because it is a paradox. Federalism, according to our comparative analysis, reduce the fiscal burden at the national level. And so you could, in theory, sell, let's say, fiscal federalism or fiscalization, fiscal capacity quite easily, but that require a mediation, because when you introduce federalism, the fiscal burden at the member state level is going to reduce. You can share a lot of cost. Defense is an example of that. So that requires political party or political leader with a rationale in that direction. Giuseppe, yes, of course, there is a legitimacy of what you call populist. Indeed, they are in the government in many cases, so the question is not that, but it's rather to challenge those positions and to make clear what do they want to reach. And that is an example for Hungary and Poland in our research, but also for Italy and more for France. What does it mean, Le Pen presidency in terms of European Union development? Because Le Pen made clear in the last election that she doesn't want to follow the Farage or the British road. But she doesn't say, or she didn't say, what kind of road she wants to follow. So that I would say that, okay, this is a caveat. What we need to do is exactly what Jan-Erik said. We need to increase capability at the center. And if you increase capability at the center, you are able also to deal with this formidable challenge. At that regard, Next Generation EU is a good step, but it's not an entire step in that direction. Because in Next Generation EU, you have European debt, and then you give the European debt resources to the member state to spend according to specific criteria negotiated with the European Commission. The crucial step is going in the direction of European public good. So you have European debt spent by government or governance in Europe for European public good without any, let's say, specific advantage for one or the other member state. And that is the debate that we need to make. So it's not only to have a European debt, the taboo that Brigitte talked today, but it's not, the real taboo is to let the Commission, under the vigilance of the European Parliament and the Council, to spend those resources for European public good. I don't know if that taboo will be overcome, but that is, it seems to me, the crucial issue. Next Generation EU is only a step in the direction, but is not the entire direction. So, and yeah, okay, yes, I use sovereignty, Jan-Erik, because that is the debate, but the concept of autonomy is an interesting concept that we can use certainly. Magda, you call me into question because you raised a very important issue. So let's say we use East and West not for let's say classical methodological reason. We use two countries in which sovereignists are in power, and two countries before writing publishing the article in which sovereignty could enter into power. Then when we finish the article in one country, in my country, the sovereignists enter into power. But we use, again, sorry for using this Sartori political relevance. So you have to investigate political relevant actors. Why so? Because when they enter into government, Poland and Hungary, or when they are in the process for entering into government, they are obliged to deal with the process of integration. If you are a minority party without any chance to enter into government, you don't need to elaborate a view on the European integration. But if you are, like now, Meloni into government, you have to deal with the European Council, Council of Ministers, Commission, Parliament. So you have to deal with those issues that Meloni never dealt with when she was in the opposition. So here is the relation, the selection of our champions. Is those in power or very near to power. And in that sense, yes, economy versus identity is crucial because Poland doesn't want to enter in the Eurozone exactly for those reasons that you told. But also it's important for us to understand that one of the weak points of the integration, of the enlargement in the past, that we introduced very high level of criteria, the Copenhagen criteria, but once you are in, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to readdress, to make, to condition countries that do not behave as they promised to behave, as they signed at the very beginning to behave. So, of course, we know that from a comparative federal perspective, we had, the southern states, in which you have the institutionalization after the Civil War of an autocratic pro-slavery regime. They abolished the slavery, but remain an autocratic regime for more than 1 century. And that, if you do comparative analysis, that is crucial. That after 1864, you need to wait 1964 for having Martin Luther King movement and then the civil rights legislation. So do we want to follow this road? I think comparison is useful for that at that regard. I don't think so. And so either we find elements, it was Chris yesterday, also the right to exclude somebody, which is part of an agreement, or we find a different kind of organization, more level, I don't know, more form organization, but here is the issue that you raise. In any case, the Italian case, I don't know the French case because we don't have yet, the Italian case say that if you are in the Eurozone, you are highly constrained. Contrary to what Claude said before, if you are in the Eurozone, you are either constrained from within or you are powerfully constrained from without through the market. And Meloni is very aware that with a public debt of 145% of our GDP, the market is really a serious controller of the government. So probably we need to ask Poland and Hungary to enter in the Eurozone.
Well, unless you want to comment on.
I mean, maybe just quickly on this connection between the networking of populists, as I find it very interesting, and also I can link it to what Magda actually commented on before you ask your question, and this is highly relevant, I would say, because we are observing this parallel alternative community growing that has its own vision of European integration and its own vision of what sovereignty is. And in this respect, I don't dare to answer your question, Tiziano, but definitely there are many ways we understand sovereignty, and it can be interpreted in many different aspects. And in this respect, what comes to my mind was these meetings that we had, several of them, the Warsaw Summit, the Madrid Summit, the Budapest Summit, when the important, not always in power, but important political parties from around Europe gathered to discuss this populist worldview, the right-wing populist parties from Western and Eastern Europe united. And in this respect, I don't think we should ignore it, because this is the alternative voice that actually becomes a mainstream in the countries in which they are in power. And as you recall today, this speech of Morawiecki, this is exactly the claim. So we need EU for certain issues, but this is the EU we know now, is not the EU we want. So in this respect, I think we should devote a bit more time, again, maybe next project, to actually understand this aspect, maybe more from the cultural lens than just analyzing the claims through the political or economic one.
Thanks. I'll be very brief. I think on sovereignty, I agree with what Jan-Erik was saying, that I don't think it is really possible using the language of sovereignty to make that move that you described, which, I mean, you can take that either way. That can be reason to stick to the language of sovereignty, or it can be reason to abandon the language of sovereignty. But I don't think that that kind of argument is easily made in the terms of sovereignty. I won't go through all of them. Maybe just one thing on the networking of populism across boundaries. So yeah, I think it's eminently possible and is happening. So it's clearly such on the left insofar as it's a kind of a rendition of earlier forms of internationalism. Whether all of these terms require the name populism, I don't know. But important, I think, to emphasize that Syriza's challenge to the EU in the first half of 2015 was carefully coded as being in Europe's name, not in Greece's name. And so to that extent, it was a claim that was explicitly meant to be generalizable to those outside the country. But of course, I think also on the right as well, one can also expect that populisms can network across boundaries precisely insofar as they may often be a critique of the EU in the name of Europe and European civilization and things which are not reducible to a particular state. These are exactly the basis of networking across boundaries. This is not necessarily a nationalist form of politics. Former PhD student of mine, Marta Lorimer, did a kind of historical study of right-wing thought about Europe from the 60s onwards, and the message is very much that for long periods of time, including up to the present, it's an explicitly pan-European orientation and a critique of the EU, but in the name of something wider than the nation. And so to that extent, I think that's makes it ideologically very possible to expect the networking of populism across boundaries. There's a whole range of organizational and institutional issues that follow on, but in terms of the basic capacity to articulate claims across boundaries in this idiom, very much so, I think, on both left and right.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we say that we have maybe not exploited completely the topic, but at least we had very important reflections on it. So I think it's time to conclude this panel. We have just 5 minutes late for lunch, so it's not very bad. Thank you very much. Thank you all the panelists for keeping time and for, of course, excellent interventions. And thank you for the questions. Thank you all.